Good morning, guys. I am going to be sharing, commentary on the notes from yesterday. So let me go ahead and get my screen share going so you can see what all I'm talking about. And these are the slides that I posted yesterday. There are some videos in here. I'm not going to play the videos, obviously, but you should definitely watch them if you have not already. So I did include the word of the day for yesterday, just because nitrogen fixation is a very important vocabulary term. So nitrogen fixation is basically what you see right here, inert nitrogen gas. That just means that the nitrogen that's in the atmosphere, most of our atmosphere is made up of nitrogen. So all of this nitrogen, N2, is just sitting in the atmosphere. That's what they're talking about, inert nitrogen gas. Well, it's not actually useful to you or me. We need it, but nitrogen gas can't be turned into anything else. We can't build it up. We can't break it down. We can't do anything with it. But we still need to get at that nitrogen. So nitrogen fixation is when bacteria in the soil and the roots of plants basically manipulate, transform nitrogen gas into ammonium. And it uses the things that are in the environment, naturally, nitrogen and hydrogen, and it just basically does some chemical rearranging that we can't do and that plants can't do on their own. Only the bacteria can do it. So this is an image that shows you how this occurs. Now it seems like it's fairly involved. The most important thing you need to know about nitrogen fixation is that it turns nitrogen gas in the atmosphere into a form that animals and plants can use. That's the big idea, basically. The question was, observe the diagram above illustrating the nitrogen cycle. Based on the information in the diagram, what could be done to increase the amount of nitrogen removed from the atmosphere? So increase nitrogen removed from the atmosphere. Basically, you want to look at this picture over here. The things that are taking nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So industrial fixation, biological fixation, which can take place in the oceans, or it can take place on land through bacteria in the earth. So here, we're looking for the options that lead to an increase in nitrogen being removed. So either biological fixation needs to increase or industrial fixation needs to increase. So A gave us decreased number of industrial facilities that create fertilizers. Well, these industrial facilities making fertilizers are removing nitrogen for the atmosphere, so you have to get rid of A. A is bad. It's a bad idea. B, increase the use of fungicide to manage the number of decomposers. So decomposers are the ones that are taking nitrogen from the atmosphere and turning it into ammonium, which we need to use. So that would be bad also. A is bad, B is bad. C, decrease the number of nitrifiers that convert ammonia into nitrate in the soil. Or D, increase the farming of plants that contain bacteria and root nodules. So between the last two, D makes the most sense. You want to increase how many plants are out there with bacteria in the roots, because the more bacteria there are, the more nitrogen is being pulled from the air. I know it kind of seems tricky, but it's one of those things you have to actually think through. So why is the nitrogen cycle important? We don't eat nitrogen. It's not like sugar for us. It's not an energy source, but it is vital to some of our biomolecules. So looking through here, I know I wrote a lot. 70% of the air, 78% of the air is nitrogen. The vast majority of the air that we walk through, that we breathe every day, is nitrogen. We don't use it, we just send it right back out. Okay, it doesn't get transformed. We just breathe in, out, it goes out also, but nothing changes. It's nitrogen in and it's nitrogen out. Nitrogen is important to life because it's a key part of amino acids and nucleic acids. So think about those two things. We have heard those terms before. Amino acids build up proteins. Proteins are responsible for everything that your body does. And nitrogen is also needed for nucleic acids. Your nucleic acids, things like your DNA and your RNA. So without nitrogen, you have no DNA, which means you don't exist. Without nitrogen, you have no proteins, which means that your DNA doesn't make anything in the end. It's just a string of letters, a combination of the same four letters over and over and over again. if there's no more nitrogen to make proteins. So it's really, really important. It's very fundamental to our existence. This is why we need nitrogen. Not that it feeds us, but that it helps us develop proteins, and it's what helps build our DNA and our RNA. Neither plants or animals can obtain nitrogen directly from the atmosphere. Instead, they depend on a process known as nitrogen fixation. That's what we looked at earlier, where nitrogen from the atmosphere gets turned into a usable form for us. Key players in this process are legumes and the symbiotic bacteria which are associated with the legume root nodules. Legumes would be mostly things like nuts, like peanuts. These bacteria are known as nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These organisms convert nitrogen in the soil to ammonia, which can then be taken up by plants. This process also occurs in aquatic ecosystems where cyanobacteria participate. So there are specific types of bacteria that live on the roots of specific plants that take nitrogen from the atmosphere and transform it into a molecule that plants can take up through the roots and that we can get by consuming plants or by consuming animals that have eaten plants. It's a whole chain of things that you have to kind of grasp to get this, right? So we eat animals, or we eat plants, or we eat animals that have eaten plants, and those plants have absorbed nitrogen in a usable form through their roots because bacteria took nitrogen from the atmosphere and turned it into a usable molecule. This is a very simplified version. So atmospheric nitrogen, N2, get taken into the soil. Rhizobium, that's a type of relationship between bacteria and roots. So they turn it into ammonia. That's kind of like an intermediate step. And then nitrogen-fying bacteria, these are the ones who turn it into the final useful thing. They make nitrates and they make ammonia. And plants absorb the nitrates and make protein out of it. And then animals eat the plants, or animals eat the plants, and then they get that same thing. It's a chain of events that has to happen for you to even be able to get the nitrogen that you need in the first place. So again, these are just images of how this works. I don't want to go through every single step. You should look through this and see all the different pathways, because it can cycle back and forth, and it always does. Once nitrogen gets fixed, it doesn't mean that it stays that way forever, right? So the forms that we see of nitrogen, we see atmospheric nitrogen, we see ammonium, we see nitrites, and we see nitrates. The thing I need you to know is that the form that gets used by animals and plants is the one at the very end of nitrogen fixation, the one that's at the very end of this chain of bacteria transforming nitrogen. The second thing, we have the nitrogen cycle and we have the carbon cycle. Just a second. Janie, no, you're not gonna yell at me right now. Every living organism on Earth requires carbon for all basic biomolecules. You've heard that life on Earth is carbon-based. That's because all of our biomolecules, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, all four of those, the molecules required for life, require carbon. See this here, elements in the biomolecule structure. Carbohydrates have carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. Lipids have carbons, hydrogens, oxygens. Proteins have carbons, hydrogens, oxygens, nitrogens. Nucleic acids have carbons, hydrogens, oxygens, nitrogens, and phosphorus, but they also have more complex structure because our nucleic acids, your DNA, your RNA, they're these strands, these really, really, really large, complex molecules with lots of repeating letters. But the most fundamental component to life on this planet is carbon. Without carbon, there is no life form. There are no biomolecules. And once you get to chemistry, you'll kind of have a better understanding, but carbon is basically the element that can be friends with anyone and can have lots of friends, or can just have one really good friend. By friends, I mean bonds. You'll understand more when you get to chemistry. But basically, it's just like the social butterfly of all of the elements. So it works really, really well for building things. It can work with lots of other elements really easily without being super reactive, which reactivity can be very dangerous when we're talking about molecules at this level. So carbon is basically the perfect element for building things. And all the carbon present in the world today is the same carbon that there was at the beginning of the formation of life. Elements, atoms, they don't get created, they don't get destroyed. Once they existed at the beginning of their physical presence, then they exist always. They just change forms. They just get rearranged into different molecules, or they can be elements, atoms, all on their own. But they don't disappear. You can't get rid of them. When new organisms are born and grow, no new carbon is actually created. It must be cycled through the biosphere. So the foods that you eat cycle into your body and help you build as you grow. You continue to eat and have to build up new molecules, new structures in your body, because your cells are living, so they die and they have to be replaced. So this constant need for replenishment of our molecules takes place throughout our entire life. But it still has to be cycled through. So it's used, it serves its purpose, it's probably released as waste of some sort, or it's recycled somewhere else in the body, but it never disappears. There are big reservoirs for carbon. Now, you might have heard this term and just not understand what it means, because it's something they like to say in the news. And you guys, while people like to rag on you for being on your phones all the time, you always know what's going on. You always at least know what the headlines are. And sometimes these headlines talk about reservoirs of carbon. Now, the cycle is usually thought of as 4 major reservoirs of carbon interconnected by pathways of exchange. What does that mean? A reservoir is where something is stored. So looking here, there's a reservoir of carbon in the ocean carbon store. There's just a bunch of carbon that we can't actually use. And then you have atmospheric carbon. So that's CO2 emissions, that's carbon dioxide building up in the atmosphere. It could be carbon in other forms of gases in the atmosphere, but the primary form of carbon you're going to find in the atmosphere is carbon dioxide, even though it can appear in other ways in other molecules, just depending. They're probably just very, 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 very small quantities. But that's carbon that we can't use unless it gets fixed or changed or turned into glucose by plants. You have biosphere carbon store. That would be biomass, living mass of organisms on the planet. So this, even we would contribute to biosphere carbon, because we are living things that contain and are made up of carbon. Animals and plants and bacteria and fungi and protists and all of the living things contribute to biosphere carbon store. We're just carbon that can't be used in our natural form. Now we can access carbon by eating plants, by eating animals. That's us getting access to carbon, usually through things like carbohydrates or sugars, like extremely large carbohydrates like you think of when you think of bread, or simple sugars like sugar cane. And then you have lithosphere carbon. Now this, again, is an inaccessible form of carbon. Lithosphere means the earth. This is carbon that's stored in limestone. We have a lot of limestone around here. This is carbon that is stored in coals and oils and gas, and even the diamonds that we mine all throughout the world. All those things are made up of carbon in some form. So the reservoirs here, it says the atmosphere, terrestrial, so that's the lithosphere, Freshwater systems are included, and so is non-living organic matter such as soil and carbon. The oceans are a reservoir, and sediments, so fossil fuels. Those are all reservoirs for carbon. But where else is carbon wrapped up? So we see carbon all over the place. The graphite in your pencil, that's carbon. It's pure carbon. It's actually the exact same carbon that makes up a diamond. They're exactly the same. There is no chemical difference between their structures besides one was under heat and pressure, a lot of heat and pressure, and it turned it into a beautiful diamond. Carbon is wrapped up in the emissions that we send out whenever we are burning fossil fuels. And it's also found in fossils themselves. So fossil fuels, it makes sense that when they're burned, they create carbon because they are carbon. So I would definitely take a look at this video, Carbon and Nitrogen Cycles. Yes, it's amoeba sisters, but it's also extremely useful, extremely helpful in helping you understand, how the cycles work and what their importance is without having to be too technical about it. More about the carbon cycle. So something that you really need to take away from this is what biomolecules, these different types of elements, are used in. The carbon cycle is important because carbon is found in every single one of the biomolecules that we need to be able to live. That's why they're called biomolecules, right? Molecules for life. Photosynthesis is how carbon enters the biotic world, the living world, where plants can get carbon and animals can get carbon, and all the other things in between and beyond can get carbon. All the living things can get access to it. And it's why producers are so vital. It's why we learn about food webs and food chains at the same time as we learn about all of this. They are the basis for life on this planet. If we did not have plants, we would not just have no food, we would also have no access to those extremely important fundamental molecules like carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids. Primary consumers are the ones that allow carbon to travel up the energy pyramid. So people like me allow it, and herbivores allow the energy and the molecules of carbon and the nitrogen to be passed up. So that's why it's so important that there are all of these levels. It's why even if you're an animal that eats other animals, at some point in this chain, an animal has to eat a plant. So how does carbon get into oceans? I think that's one of the big questions. It gets dissolved and combines with calcium in the shells of animals. So like crab shells and lobster shells and all the shells of the crustaceans that you find, even snail shells on land, those things eventually break down. And when they do, they contribute to soil or they become limestone. So here's an image. This carbon cycle honestly is a little bit simpler because there's really only one way that it can go. Carbon dioxide in the air gets taken into plants through photosynthesis, and it gets turned into organic carbon. Organic carbon, all you need to know about organic carbon, that term means usable carbon. Carbon for living things. When we eat the plants, we get access to that carbon in the form of glucose, C6H12O6. When we respire, we release carbon out into the world, the carbon that we don't need. We release it out into the atmosphere. It goes back up. Plants do the same thing. Plants take carbon in, they let it out, but carbon at some point gets incorporated into lots of molecules. It doesn't always just get breathed out. So take a look at this a little bit more. It is much more of a cycle. It's much more of a circle, easy to follow. There's really one way in and one way out. And it's a little bit easier, I think, to grasp than the nitrogen cycle, just kind of take a look at that. Watch the video of it for sure. So here's a little bit of a commentary. For dead organisms and waste products, there's also a form of organic carbon, no longer glucose or carbohydrates. Now, instead, it's proteins and lipids and nucleic acids. So it has been transformed into other biomolecules. Most of Earth's carbon is stored in the ocean, not the atmosphere, but the ocean. There's estimated to be between 38 billion to 40 billion metric tons of carbon in the ocean itself, with whopping 66 million to 100 million billion metric tons of carbon in marine sediments and sedimentary rocks. Those numbers are so big, I can't even try to explain them to you. Millions of billions of metric tons. We know how large the ocean is. As much carbon as there is in the atmosphere, it's not anywhere near as much as there is in the sediments. But the reason that the carbon that is in the atmosphere is such a big deal is because it interferes with the proportions of gases that are in the atmosphere. Lydia, come here. Very sorry. It interferes with the proportions of gases, and those gases, it's not necessarily that they benefit us or harm us as far as biologically, but the atmosphere is a finely balanced situation where any major or minor changes can affect the way that the earth is heated, the way that we breathe. It can affect weather patterns, it can affect climate change. So while yes, there is more carbon stored in the sediments in the ocean, that's not necessarily going to interfere with our livelihood, with our planet, as much as the carbon that's in the atmosphere, even though the carbon in the atmosphere is less, if that makes any sort of sense. You know, the atmosphere is going to protect us. It's going to regulate our climate. The sediments in the ocean, not regulating our climate so much. One last thing. If you don't believe me about how vital carbon is to life, there is this website that is kind of interesting. Ashes to diamonds. This is just to show you that, okay, diamonds are made up of pure carbon. And you can take your ashes or your pet's ashes, if you or your pet is cremated or someone that you love is cremated, and you can have their ashes turned into diamonds because there is that much carbon. You burn away basically everything else, and what you're left with is the carbon that built up your body, and it's a physical, measurable amount. I mean, everyone's seen ashes in an urn. That's a lot of ashes. All of that is carbon. And you can have that carbon turned into a diamond. Now, you can look around here and you can find other websites that will do this. And I'm not encouraging anyone to do this or discouraging anyone from doing this. It's just kind of showing you, oh, wow, there really is that much carbon in a living thing, enough carbon to turn someone into a diamond. And you can choose how big that diamond is depending on how much you're going to pay. Again, I'm not encouraging you to do this. I'm not discouraging you to do this. I'm just showing you this is scientific evidence that you can understand that shows you there's so much carbon in a living thing that living thing can be turned into a diamond. And in fact, probably all of the diamonds in the world, likely all of the diamonds in the world, were once living things. And they just withstood pressure and time for a very long period of time, and a lot of heat. And at the end, all of that carbon became, you know, kind of purified in a crystallized form and united with a diamond. I hope that you guys got a little bit more out of me talking you through these slides. If you need any help, definitely look at the videos and then come to me with your questions, okay? Zoom 3 times today, 9 a.m., 12:30, 3:30. I hope to see you guys. Bye-bye.